Welcome to the Big Questions Debate Final. We began with 161 contestants, and you're about to experience debate between the top 2 contestants in the Big Questions debate. This year, students grappled with complex worldview questions as they debate both sides of the topic. Resolved, moral systems rooted in theism are preferable to non-theistic moral systems. Thanks to our TAB team of Joe Vaughn from Scarborough High School, New York, Cheryl Kosmerick, Lexington High School, Massachusetts, Adesawa Amarui, Alief Taylor High School, Texas, Dr. Colleen Mooney Coughlin, the William Tennant School, Pennsylvania, and Dr. Lamont Howard, Texas Southern University, Texas. It is my pleasure to introduce the esteemed judges for the Big Questions Debate Final. Stephanie Brotherton, 2-diamond coach from Kickapoo High School in Springfield, Missouri, coached a top 60 Big Question student and coaches the 45th school in the country for growth in the last year. Luke Craig. Luke has helped coach over 50 national qualifiers and state champions from the great state of Alabama. John Goldberger from Cottonwood Classical Preparatory School, a 1-diamond coach from New Mexico. Alex Kalmar, a 1-diamond coach from Eastern Ohio who has coached multiple national and state qualifiers. Carrie Conda from Aberdeen Central High School out of South Dakota. Carrie is the 2024 National Debate Coach of the Year and a 3-star diamond coach. Cordell McDougald out of Columbia High School, a 2-time state speech judge, a 2-time state debate judge, Idaho Gem of the Mountain Volunteer of the Year, and just a dad from Nampa, Idaho. And our final judge, Jethro Smith, a 1-diamond coach of multiple debate runner-ups at nationals from Highland High School in Idaho, Jethro Smith. As written on the ballots, the affirmative code is 194. The negative code is 153. Now I present to you the final round of Big Questions.
First and foremost, I'd like to give some thank yous. Firstly, I'd like to thank the National Speech and Debate Association for coordinating this event and making this incredible experience possible in the first place. I also want to thank my school's BEI staff for all of the work they put in for our debate program and for allowing us to have the opportunity to even compete at the national level. I also want to thank Coach Crown for the tremendous work you've put in through the past 2 years. I can't even begin to express my gratitude for how much you've helped me grow, both as a debater, as a competitor, and as a person. From the first ever practice debate you judged me freshman year to standing here just 2 seasons later, I hope I can be carrying on your legacy. I also want to thank Coach Lillian and my entire team. I wish I could list out every single one of you guys, but I'm pretty sure I have a time limit. So thank you, Hannah, Kelly, Johan, Meher, Parab, and the rest of the LD squad. And also, I want to shout out my indirect team, Callista, Colin, Tian, James, Caitlin, Amanda, and everyone else who became my teammate this tournament or this past season. You guys all make debate worth doing. Lastly, I want to thank my family for everything they've sacrificed just so I can participate in this activity, from waking up at 7 a.m. to drive me to tournaments, to having to listen to me talk at 200 words per minute at 12 a.m. You guys have gone through so much for me. Thank you, Dad, for always accompanying me to tournaments, and thank you, Mom and Carrie, for always cheering me on from home. I love you guys. I also would not be on stage today without any of your guys' help. Lastly, I'd like to also thank my opponent. Fun fact, we actually came up with a secret handshake that I really hope I don't forget by the end of this round, so stay tuned. With that, I'll begin if everyone is ready. On January 1st, Martin Luther King Jr. joined more than 5,000 activists at what is today called the Altria Theater, where we will all gather in a couple of hours to lead a pilgrimage of prayer and march on the state's capital. He called on us all to reject racism and baked his language in the ethics of religion to give a higher authority to his message. Because I recognize that morality rooted in religion promotes righteous action, I am proud to affirm today's resolution resolved. Moral systems rooted in theism are preferable to non-theistic moral systems. To start, I'd like to first offer some definitions. Rooted in is defined as based on or caused by something. A moral system is defined as a system of principles and values to form one's perspective. Theism is defined as the belief in the existence of a god or gods, and preferable is defined as having greater value and desirability. Now, to frame this round, I first offer two observations. Firstly, moral systems should be evaluated not just on theoretical coherence, but also on their ability to actually guide and motivate behavior for real human agents with cognitive limitations and limited philosophical training. Second, because the resolution asks us which system is preferable, proving that morality can exist independent of theism, or that theism is imperfect, does not negate. To clarify, we can't just prove that X is bad, but that Y is better for a unique reason. Now onto my contentions for today's debate. My contention 1 is that theism is a more effective motivator for moral action. As much as we may want to believe otherwise, our decisions, particularly our moral decisions, are driven by our emotions. An experiment by philosopher and researcher Rodrigo Diaz from 2023 found that when both moral beliefs were used as independent variables, moral emotions had a significant effect on participants. In other words, moral rules and reasoning that non-theistic systems relied on didn't drive people to make a moral choice, but rather our emotions did. You may be thinking, why does this relate to religion? Well, theism has been shown to prompt stronger moral emotions. A recent study examining the differences in how people experience immorality and morality found that religious people have stronger emotional reactions to moral and immoral choices. This makes sense. Theistic moral systems rely on faith, and they deal with existential questions, both of which are topics that carry emotional baggage. In the same way that people can be more emotional at a sports game, a concert, or a protest, religious congregations can intensify one's moral feelings. Thus, theism is a stronger motivator for action. A study conducted of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim Americans found that volunteering and donations to the poor are especially common for those who are religious. 45% say that they volunteered in the past week, but just 28% who aren't religious say that they volunteered. Next, contention 2 is that theism generally provides social support networks as well as increased physical and mental health. This creates happier, more resilient, and safer communities. A study done by Professor Linda George from Duke University and others from 2009 found that there is evidence that religious involvement is associated with better physical health, better mental health, and longer survival. Organized religion also increases social interaction by creating community-based environments that foster social bonds and support. But according to a 2018 study done by Andrew Abeda of Rutgers University, even for those who don't feel particularly connected to their religious communities, even the very belief in a God can provide comfort and alleviate loneliness or a lack of purpose. Furthermore, Research has also confirmed that theism is linked to public safety. Columnist David Briggs explains in 2013 that religion linked to fewer violent crimes. Communities with high participation in congregations may be more effective in reducing assaults and murders in areas that suffer from violent crimes. A Baylor University study of more than 15,000 people found that young adults who considered themselves religious were less likely to commit violent crimes. Thus, in conclusion, theistic moral systems have proven themselves to be more effective motivators, generate safer and happier communities, and when evaluated under a simple risk and reward framework, are the most logical to follow. Thus, I am proud to affirm.
I was told I have 5 minutes to give thank yous. I will try not to take the entirety of that time. That being said, I do have a lot of people to thank, so bear with me. Thank you to the NSDA for making all of this possible and sometimes making sure the extempers and debaters had Wi-Fi. Thank you to the BQ staff, the board, and all my judges and competitors who made it possible for me to debate throughout this tournament. Thank you to my district and all the friends I've made within it. Thank you to the NSDA memes page for always making sure BQ is represented among the ones made fun of. Thank you to my teammates who shared a B&B with me despite my rants about theistic moral systems. Elias, you're the real DLL. Lucy, thank you for convincing Caitlin to get us ice cream. Isaac, thank you for not throwing a shoe at me when I asked you about theism's links to dentists. Tessa, thank you for training my articulacy over games of ping pong. I'm very proud of you, Senate finalist. Andy, thank you for listening to my 11 p.m. philosophy that has about 10% coherence. Thank you, Hudson, Will, Jayla, Trevor, Kat, Alex, too, and Kyle for the help throughout this and last year's tournament. Thank you especially to Brooke and Sinwanthia for being amazing people to hang out with and prep with over the past few months. Thank you as well to all the people who have coached me. Dee for organizing and supporting the team, Lady D and Shay for all the logistics and snack support, Caitlin for supporting me and driving multiple places to find me banana bread, Aiden and Emma for teaching me much of what I know about debate, Dina for essentially being our team mom, Lutz, Cody, and Dee Marie for adopting me, and Kasich for listening to 4-hour rants on a much too frequent basis. Finally, 5 very special thank yous I have to give. Thank you to Alex D. Martin for taking the time to coach me from a scared and choppy debater to someone who can make final stage. Thank you to Izzy for being my prep buddy for these past 2 years of BQ. I am very proud of you and how far you've come and grateful for all you've helped me. Thank you to my family for supporting me in all my chaotic endeavors and aspirations. I couldn't do it without you. I love you guys. Thank you to all of Michelle Lindquist for giving me hope and entertaining more of my dumb quasi-philosophical questions than anyone should ever have to. I appreciate you being in my life more than I can ever express, and I eagerly await the banana bread I've been promised. And lastly, thank you to my opponent for being such a fun person to talk to while we awaited this round. I'm excited for our debate and our handshake. With that, one trigger warning before we get on to the debate. Please be advised that this case does discuss topics of rape and genocide. If those subjects make you uncomfortable, please prioritize your well-being over watching this round. With that, time starts on my first word. I stand in strong negation of resolve. Moral systems rooted in theism are preferable to non-theistic moral systems. For clarity, I define theism with Oxford Dictionary as belief in a deity or deities, non-theism as norms based on naturalistic observations and conjectures, and moral system with NIH as a system that evaluates human character or behavior as good or bad, right or wrong. 2 observations on framing. First, an argument only proves a system preferable if the argument is generalizable to that category and only if it arises from their grounding principles. Second, claims about unverifiable metaphysical states cannot be weighed against measurable harms. Thus, the framework for assessing which is preferable in today's round is which moral system minimizes oppression. Contention 1 is systemic oppression. Theism provides 2 consistent mechanisms for oppression. First, the creation of an in-group and an out-group that is based on what is considered divine and objective. Rizaki Tran 17 finds that helping and submissive behaviors are directed only to the in-group theistic members, but not towards theistic outsiders. The study concludes that in practice, pro-social theistic rules apply only to the in-group. Dunkel et al. 16 corroborates. Theism is predictive of in-group favoritism. Crucially, Ettingoff et al. 21 extends that this favoritism leads to the denial that out-group individuals are rational individuals, thereby perpetuating theistic prejudice. This divide leads to oppression of the out-group. Second, the increased capacity of leaders to perpetuate oppression due to the concept of divine authority. The authority bias refers to our tendency to be more influenced by the opinions and judgments of authority figures. No authority is greater and more unquestioned than that which is believed to be divinely given. Perzuki et al. 21 finds that studies suggest that God beliefs and appeals have easily controllable behavioral consequences and curb defection. This is used for oppression at every scale, subjugating entire groups, creating cults, and furthering division and corruption. While non-theistic systems can have bias and authority, only theism frames these as divinely given, leading to horrific oppression across domains, but within the scope of this round, we'll evaluate two. Subpoint A, sexist oppression. Misogyny is rooted deep within theistic systems. PRC 16 finds history's most influential theistic leaders tend to be predominantly, if not exclusively, male. Further, these sexist norms are built into theists' very interpretation of God. As Shapiro 13 furthers that out of the people that believe God has a gender, 98% believe that God is male. Kramer and Morrow, too, corroborate that the core texts of world religions are all inherently misogynistic. Even niche theistic systems such as Jainism believe that women cannot achieve enlightenment without being reborn as men first. These foundational factors lead to internalized prejudice and active oppression. Ettengoff et al. 21 confirms that meta-analyses, multinational studies, qualitative and quantitative research strongly suggest that theism is inherently related to sexism. Jelbadiv et al. 24 explains that not only do the majority of theistic men believe that they have God-given worth higher than women, the majority of theistic women believe they aren't given the same moral worth by God. Kramer and Morrow, too, quantifies that this enables and perpetuates the hatred of women over billions of people. When a system, both by its nature and use, defines women as deserving of less worth, opportunity, and rights than men, it cannot be considered preferable. Subpoint B, child brides. Kidman 17 finds globally 9% or 360 million girls were married before they turned 15 and 20% before the age of 18. UNICEF and Kraft et al. 24 explain theistic spiritual values and gender norms are key in this problematic cycle. Jelbadiv et al. 24 and Hashimi 22 further that justifications for child marriage are leveraged from theistic texts. We see this play out empirically. Vogelstein 14 details that across regions and beliefs, theism is the defining factor causing child brides. Germondi and Wooden 15 discovered a link between faith and the practice of child marriage in 33 different countries in Africa. This child marriage locks girls into heavily abusive cycles. Kidman 17 shows that girls married before the age of 15 are almost 50% more likely to have experienced either physical or sexual intimate partner violence than those married after 18. Contention 2, the tree of progress blossoms through non-theistic roots. Non-theistic moral systems place the burden of proof on those making moral claims. Theistic systems place the burden on divine authority. When people can ask, prove it, rather than being told God says so, errors and abuses are easier to identify and correct, making non-theistic systems less corruptible and more self-correcting. The inability to verify theistic claims leads to less progress within human rights and development. Carnegie et al. 19 details that human rights practices are worse in highly theistic societies. Ziao 15 corroborates that when adjusted for income inequality, there is a negative correlation between religiosity and well-being as measured by the Human Development Index. By contrast, non-theism empirically drives human rights and progress within societies. TNVD 13 explains that when regarding issues of infant mortality, poverty, homicide rates, literacy, per capita income, education, and gender equality, the best nations are the most non-theistic. Theism perpetuates oppression while non-theism brings about progress, thus I negate. Thank you.
Are you good for cross-sects?
Yep.
I'll take the first question since I spoke first.
Of course.
What's your definition of a non-theistic moral system?
All right, the definition of a non-theistic moral system is norms based on naturalistic observations and conjectures.
Sure, you can take a question.
All right, so in your second observation, you say that just proving that theism is imperfect isn't the burden of the neg, but if something is uniquely worse within theism, doesn't that mean that something's uniquely better within non-theism?
Yes, if you prove that something is uniquely worse within theism as compared to non-theism, that would be a reason why it's preferable. Our specific observation, to clarify, is just saying that just because you prove that theism might not be perfect, that doesn't give the judges a reason to negate. I'm going to take a question.
Sure.
Let's talk about your contention 2 about the tree of progress. Your study indicating that there's negative correlation between theism and economic growth. How is this study conducted?
All right, I can give you the study, but this TNVD 13 study pretty
I don't need to know what your study is. I just want to know how your study was conducted.
Sure. Okay, so they put all of the countries that they had into a regression model and essentially looked at the idea of what their non-theistic populations and their government based on theism or non-theism correlated with their human development index and their poverty and all those other listed out.
So it only looked at, one, how rich these countries were, and two, whether or not the majority of their population was religious?
So it depends on which card you're asking about, but if you're asking about that TNVD 13 card, it looked at 11 different dimensions, but it specifically looked to see if non-theism or theism was correlated.
But to clarify, the only variables taken into that study were how rich these countries were and how majority of their population was religious or non-religious, correct?
The independent variable was the religious or non-religious, and the dependent variable were the domains that I listed: infant mortality, poverty, homicide rates, literacy, per capita income, education, and gender equality, not just wealth. May I have a question?
Sure, you can take a question.
All right, so on your contention 1, you cite this card about 45% of theists volunteering.
Yes.
What's that card from again?
Yes, the specific card is from a Pew Research study, and the tag is Lipka from 2016. Do you want me to tell you more specifics about that evidence?
Sure, can I have the operational definition of volunteer from that study?
I don't think the study itself defines volunteering, but we would say that that study literally takes religious people and it interviews them to see whether or not they were more likely to give back to their communities, i.e. through donations, helping the poor, or volunteering at certain institutions. The definition of volunteering is to help somewhere without pay. Do we agree on that?
I'd say your study doesn't have an operational definition, which would make it fallible, but you can have a question.
Sure. Let's talk about your contention 1 about oppression. What is it about a theistic moral system uniquely that is used to oppress people as opposed to an actual theism or religion?
Sure, there's many mechanisms, but the 3 main ones that I discuss is the in-group and out-group that's reinforced with the conjecture of objectivity.
That's not my question. Everything that you're talking about is specific to theism and religion. My question is about a theistic moral system.
All right, so essentially a theistic moral system is going to be a set of principles and values guided by the conjecture of God. That's verbatim the definition of religion. So when we see that the creation of an in-group and an out-group has that objectivity conjecture, that's going to be uniquely harmful.
I will take running prep time starting now. That was 5 seconds. The order of this speech is going to be going straight down his case. Look, at the end of this debate, a system that cannot protect its own people cannot win your ballot. But let's start on the framework debate. We agree with both their observations, and we also agree that minimizing oppression is important. But firstly, we tell you that the only way to look at this is through consequentialism, meaning that our framework comes first. But secondly, even if you think that their framework is better, we'll still prove to you why we minimize oppression better than they can. With that, let's go to their contention 1 about oppression. They first tell you that theism directly correlates to oppression, but there are multiple issues here. Firstly, understand that the resolution uses the term rooted. That's crucial because it means that we don't have to defend every single instance of theistic morality. Every single example they cite rely on singular instances in which people decided to misinterpret text or stray away from religious teachings intentionally. That doesn't prove that a theistic moral system is bad. It only proves that certain individuals are capable of corruption, which is inevitable under their world as well. But second, even if you don't buy this, we tell you that non-theism is so much worse. They gave you examples, but that pales in comparison to the atrocities justified via secular moral systems. The Soviet Union killed over 20 million people under Marxism-Leninism. China killed over 70 million people under Maoism. Cambodia killed over 2 million people under radical egalitarianism, and North Korea has killed over 3.5 million people under Juche, which means that no matter where you look, oppression and violence will always be worse in their world. They also talk about in and out groups, but here's the problem. They read you zero evidence that actually shows you, but we tell you that our studies show you that concluding that theism is actually better for community building in the first place. Anna Bjornson explains in 2024 that secular morality is actually moving towards prioritizing individuals within their own groups. But even if you don't buy this, they tell you that theistic morality has a divine authority which makes it more controllable. But we tell you that this is actually good because that kind of control is exactly what drives people to go out and do good for the world in the first place. We prove that with our evidence indicating that people who identify as religious are more likely to give back to their communities and live happier and safer lives. They also tell you that theism is misogynistic, but that doesn't apply because of the same analysis of the word rooted. Even if specific religions justify misogyny, that doesn't prove every theistic moral system not preferable. They also bring up child brides, but every argument I made earlier still applies. Look, child marriages are justified through interpretations of religious texts and not specific religions. There is no theistic system that directly mandates child brides, so every example is attributed to corrupt individuals and not the systems itself. But now, let's go on to their contention 2 about the tree of progress. They first tell you that non-theistic morality is better for progress. That's wrong. Firstly, in the past, Harvard University explains that religious moral codes function as a social technology, one that allowed humans to build and sustain complex civilizations. Societies that embedded theism into their moral frameworks actually grew and outcompeted those that didn't in the first place. The fabric of stable, advanced civilization has been throughout history, been through theistic morality in the first place. But even so, they also tell you that non-theism is more adaptable. But look at the same word, rooted, earlier. Take the example of a tree. It grows and it branches out, but its roots still stay intact in religious morality. But now, that also directly answers their second argument, because human rights can't be motivated by non-theistic systems since there's no incentive to follow them in the first place. However, human rights are a reason to vote F, because theistic morality makes people more compassionate and more likely to act on moral beliefs like human rights. For those reasons, you're easily voting F.
All right, and then I'll take running prep starting now. I have that as 30 seconds of prep taken. All right. It is because the negation assesses the scope of both the in-group and the out-group that you are going to negate today. Let's start on framework. They tell you we need to look through a consequentialist lens. I agree, but the important distinction here is that we need to look at the impacts, not the justifications. With that, let's move on to my case. Starting on my contention 1 about systemic oppression, on the link of in-group, out-group, they give you 2 responses. First, they tell you I have no evidence, which is a false conjecture. I give you Rozaki trans 17, Dunkel et al. 16, and Ettengoff et al. 21, all which tell you that prejudice is reinforced within theistic systems. They give you no counter evidence. But then they tell you that it's going to reinforce the community, but that's the exact point of this link that tells you that it's only going to be towards the in-group. That is systemically harmful. Then on divine authority, they tell you that non-theism is also going to have the same conjecture and that this is just misuse. But look back to that Perzuki et al. 21 card, which tells you that you have easy to control behavior within theistic systems. That means that there's a unique mechanism within theism that's harmful. Then they tell you that not every instance of theism is going to be harmful. My burden is not to prove to you that every instance of theism is to be harmful, but on a generalizable principle, it's going to be more harmful than non-theism. Then they tell you that non-theism is worse. They give you 3 examples. That's not a generalizable principle. If I only have you look at the sky at sunset, I can convince you that the sky is orange. Don't buy the examples, buy the generalizable principle, which I proved to you throughout 6 studies. But then, on my sexism point, they tell you that not every religion is going to be sexist, but insofar as that Kramer and Morrow 2 card tells you that the texts are all inherently misogynistic, and that Ettingoff et al. 21 card tells you the prejudice is deep-rooted, that's not going to be true. Look to these studies. But then, on child brides, they tell you this is just a misuse interpretation, but first, they tell you at the top of this speech to look at the impacts, look to the impacts. That's 360 million girls who are forced into these abusive cycles. But then secondly, look back to that Hashimi 22 and Jelbadiva et al. 24 card, which tells you these justifications are leveraged from theistic texts. Then on my tree of progress contention, they tell you that theism has been better throughout anthropological history, but I give you Whitehouse et al. 22, which tells you that's correlation, not causation. Then they tell you that these systems are still rooted in theism, but their definition of rooted is based on. These systems are not based on theism. And then they tell you that there's no incentive to follow moral systems that prioritize human rights within non-theism, but that's a false conjecture and they give you no proof. But then, on their case, starting on their contention 1 about motivators for actions, 3 attacks on the warrant before we get to the impact. First, if you're prioritizing emotion over reasoning, you're going to see harm. Look back to that Pertusky et al. 21 card, which tells you that leads to easily controllable behavioral consequences. But then second of all, they cherry pick which emotions are going to be furthered. Look back to that Ettingoff et al. 21 card, which tells you that prejudice and hatred are also furthered. That's uniquely harmful. And then third, link this to the fact that you don't actually see an increase in action when you see an increase in emotion. They don't prove that to you. But then on their impact about that 45% volunteering versus 28% volunteering, 2 things on the study before we get to the impact itself. First, this is based on self-report, which is inherently unreliable. I'd give you Ahmed et al. 11, which tells you that pro-social increases don't actually exist when you're theistic. But then secondly, I tell you they have no operational definition of volunteering, which means that study is inherently fallible. And then even then, this is only directed to the in-group. But then, on their contention 2 about social support networks, on longevity, I tell you don't let them pull that through as a moral outcome, because that A just assesses the in-group, and B, a diet of kale is not going to be equivalent to equal rights. That's a false equivalence to morality. But then on community, remember, look back to those 3 studies that I give you in case that tells you this is only directed to the in-group. Sure, it might benefit the community, but when you're unifying a community against an out-group that's uniquely harmful, that's not more moral. So at the end of the day, what we see is that the negation case stands while the affirmation case falls, and I still stand in negation. Thank you.
Okay, are you good for cross-ex?
Yep.
I want to start about your response to your contention 2. You bring up this specific piece of evidence that talks about correlation and causation, correct?
Sure.
How is that applicable to my tree response in any way whatsoever?
All right, so you talk about how throughout history theism has been beneficial for addressing social challenges, correct?
Yeah.
All right, so this Whitehouse et al. 22 card took data on 372 independent political units and found that theism wasn't actually the cause for addressing any of those social challenges. It's just a correlation that it happened to exist in those societies.
Okay, how was this study conducted?
All right, so what it did is it took those 372 independent political units from the Neolithic period to the beginning of the Industrial period, and then it decided whether or not that was based on correlation or causation through those statistical methods.
Cool, you can take a question.
So on your contention 2 about social support networks, why is it good that we see a community unifying against the outgroup?
Yes, a few responses to that. Firstly, we actually have evidence that specifically says that religious people aren't only towards their in-group, and they still tend to help out-groups. Secondly, we also have evidence that has literally disproven your whole point about in and out-groups. The card that we brought up, which went uncontested in your last speech, tells you that people who choose to follow non-theism actually are more tailored towards their in-group when compared to religious people. But I'm going to take a question. Let's talk about your response to our contention 1 about moral action. You say that we can't prioritize emotions over harm, but did we not specifically bring up the impacts of people who follow religions being more incentivized to actually do good moral action?
So I'd say first, you cherry pick which emotions are actually going to be furthered. Look back to that
That was a separate response. I'm asking about the first response you gave.
The first response I gave to you was that when you rely on emotion rather than reasoning, which my opponent tells you that you're going to further emotion within theistic systems, it leads to what that Pertusky et al. 21 card tells you, which is easily controllable behavior, which means that it can be manipulated more often and lead to greater oppression.
Okay, firstly, we've already stated that controllable behavior can be good, but it's okay, you can take a question.
All right, you talk about this evidence that you had on in-group and out-group. What was that evidence?
Yes, so specifically the evidence tells you that people who choose to follow non-theistic moral systems can also be just as tailored towards their in-groups when compared to the people who follow theistic moral systems. That quite literally disproves the uniqueness of your evidence, and it also proves that your point isn't actually offense and doesn't give us any reason to see non-theistic systems as more preferable. But I'm going to take, sorry?
I was just going to ask what the card name was.
I don't know the exact name of the card. If you want, I can show you after cross-ex.
Sure,
Is that
that'd
fine?
be great, yep.
Okay, I'll take another question. Let's specifically talk about the framework debate. In your last speech, you tell me that you should look to the impacts and not justification. Is consequentialism not quite literally looking to the impacts of an action?
Consequentialism is looking to the impacts of an action. Sure, we see the impacts are systemic oppression.
Okay, that's cross-ex.
All right, and then can I see that card?
Yes. It is, hold on. Okay, it's these two cards. And then you could scroll down.
All right, and I have that as 13 seconds of prep taken.
I will take running prep time starting now. I have that as a minute. The order of this speech is going to be going over framework, my case, their case. Let's start on the framework debate. The only response they give you in their last speech is that we should look to impacts and not justification. But remember, they conceded themselves in cross-ex that consequentialism is quite literally looking to the impacts of an action. That means that you should look to consequentialism because it's a prerequisite to their framework in the first place. But once again, even if you don't think that's right, even if you think that you should be looking to minimizing oppression, we'll still prove to you why the affirmative does that better. But now, let's start on our side of the flow. On our contention one about moral action, they give you a few responses and we'll go through each one. Firstly, they tell you that we can't prioritize emotions over harm, and they also tell you that emotions can be bad. But specifically, our Diaz 23 evidence is what specifically tells you that people who choose to follow theistic moral systems are much more prompted to feel stronger moral emotions, which incentivizes them to actually go out and do good for their communities. None of their dealings actually disprove our argument as a whole. They also tell you that our report is based on self-report, and there's no definition of volunteering. We first tell you that that's irrelevant. Just because the article doesn't define what volunteering is doesn't mean that the people within that article didn't actually go out and do those actions in the first place. It also doesn't matter if it was based on self-report because it doesn't disprove the fact that it's still a reliable study. They also tell you that this volunteering is only to in-groups, but the Lipka 16 evidence tells you that within the 45% of people who decided to volunteer, only 25% or only 20% of that volunteering was actually to religious community groups, meaning that it wasn't towards in-groups, it was also towards out-groups. Our contention too about social support. The only response they give you is that this is only to out-groups, but you can actually extend the Dunkel 16 card we read you in our last speech that tells you that this happens in non-theistic moral systems just as well. But now, let's go to their side of the flow. On their contention one about oppression, all they do in their last speech is try to extend their evidence and tell you that we don't give you any counter evidence. But remember, the empirics we gave you, no matter where you look, the rates of oppression, violence, and genocide are always going to be higher under their world. They also tell you that our examples don't prove a general principle, but if the chance of violence and oppression is always worse under a non-theistic moral system, that proves a general principle. They also try to extend their point about sexism and child brides, but what they don't respond to a single time is that the resolution uses the term rooted, meaning that we don't have to prove every single instance of theistic morality is good. It wasn't actually justified by religion, it was justified by the oppressors. But on their contention too about the tree of progress, they try to tell you that we just give you a false conjecture without any evidence. But remember, they have conceded the response that people who decide to follow non-theistic moral systems don't actually feel motivated to do good behavior. You can cross-apply the same evidence that we just read you in our last speech. For those reasons, you're easily affirming.
And then I will be taking running prep starting now. I have that as 35 seconds of prep. All right. It'll be framework, their case, my case. Starting on framing, we both agree that we need to look to the impacts of a system, which means that the justifications aren't the main thing that's going to matter. At that point, what you're going to see is that minimizing oppression is going to have the greatest magnitude in the round. Even if you buy everything in their case face value, that tells you that there's slight pro-social increases, whereas my case tells you that there's going to be systemic oppression that is going to subjugate entire populations. That's going to be the magnitude that you vote on. But then, over to their case. On their contention one about a motivator for actions, they tell you that this Diaz 23 card responds to all my attacks, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't respond to the idea that these have easily controllable consequences. When you have further emotions within theism, you have easily controllable behavioral consequences which are used for oppression. That gives theism a unique mechanism for oppression. But then secondly, remember that Ettengoff et al. 21 card, which tells you that hatred and prejudice are also going to increase in a theistic system, which means you're going to see systemic harm. Then on their PRC evidence, they tell you that it's irrelevant, that it didn't have an operational definition, and that it was self-report. I tell you that's not irrelevant, because both of those factors make the study fallible, and this is the only study on consequentialism they give you in this point. Instead, look back to that Ahmed et al. 11 card, which they don't respond to, which tells you when you have controlled settings that aren't based on self-report and have operational definitions, there isn't a pro-social increase under theism. And then on their contention too about social support networks, they drop the longevity point, don't let them bring that back up, but all they extend is that Dunkel 16 card, which tells you, I read out to you in my case that this card tells you that theism is predictive of in-group favoritism, but even then, buy those Razakian Trans 17 and Ettengoff et al. 21 cards, buy on the more literature. But then, let's go over to my case, starting on my contention one about systemic oppression. The only response that they try to extend here is that they don't have to defend every instance of theism, but when I tell you that this is going to be a generalizable principle from 11 studies throughout this contention, you see that that attack is going to fall. Because first, remember that oppressors justify theistic oppression through a unique mechanism, which they haven't responded to that. Then secondly, remember that Kramer and Morrow 2 card tells you that the justifications of oppression are leveraged from theistic texts. And then third, when you look to the impacts, look back to that Ettengoff et al. 21 card, which tells you that prejudice is always going to be furthered through these theistic systems. They haven't responded to that. They just tell you that it's going to be irrelevant. But then, on my contention too about the tree of progress, they tell you that once again, that non-theists are going to have no incentive to follow moral systems, but when you look to the empirics, they're not going to lie. Look back to that TNVD 13 card, which tells you that in domains of infant mortality, poverty, homicide rates, literacy, per capita income, education, and gender equality, theism is going to be uniquely worse while non-theism is uniquely better. That means at both the individual level when we're assessing oppression and at the societal level when we're assessing progress, non-theism is going to be the preferable moral system. Thank you.
I took 1 minute and 5 seconds earlier. That means I have 1 minute and 55 seconds left. I will take that starting now. The order of this speech is going to be going over key voting issues. Is everybody good? Okay. Remember, a system that cannot protect the people following it cannot possibly be preferable to one that can. I'll give you two really clean places that you can vote on in today's round. Firstly, the cleanest place that you can vote today is our turn on oppression. My opponent made a critical mistake when he conceded the fact that no matter where you look, oppression, violence, and genocide is always going to be worse under his world. The only front line he gives you is that, one, this resolution is about a general principle, but that's exactly our point. If that's the point, then we don't have to justify every single instance in which someone decided to purposely misinterpret religion to justify bad things. Also, they bring up the fact that oppressors use religion to justify violence, but we tell you that firstly, they've conceded the fact that we don't have to defend misuse, and secondly, they have also conceded the fact that no religious text directly mandates child brides or directly mandates misogyny in the first place. They're confusing religion with a theistic moral system. But third, remember, the really important thing to remember here is that in their last speech, they don't actually respond to the fact that no matter where you look, the death toll, the amount of violence and oppression is always going to be worse under a non-theistic moral system because there's nothing actually mandating people to do good behavior in the first place. But even if you don't want to vote on that, you can also vote on our case. You can combine our contention 1 and contention 2. Let's go through each response. Firstly, they tell you that moral emotions can have bad consequences like controllability, but what they don't respond to is the fact that controllability can be good because it actually incentivizes people to do good behavior in the first place. They also tell you that all of these things, such as self-report, make the study fallible, but that's not our only card about consequentialism. You can also extend the Briggs 13 evidence that they have conceded this entire debate, which tells you that communities with higher participation in religious congregations are more likely to have higher levels of public safety and fewer violent crimes in the first place. They also tell you that we dropped to their point about longevity. We didn't, but we'll get to that on their case. They also tell you that theism is predictive of in-group favoritism, but we tell you that what they haven't responded to is that the same scenario still happens in their world. But now, let's go to their side of the flow. Even if you don't think that our turn on their contention 1 is right, we'll still disprove it. Their contention 2 about progress is wrong. The only thing they extend is their point about longevity. But once again, they have conceded the fact that if that was the case, then all of these different countries that have built themselves upon theistic roots would not have become the powers that they are today. They have also conceded our analogy. Remember, take the example of a tree. Its roots are always going to be grounded in theism, but it can still branch out and reform and create new social norms based on current day standards. Look, remember, a system that fails to protect the very people that follow it in the first place cannot be just. Vote AF.
And I'll be taking running prep starting now. And I think I'll unprep there. And then order of the speech will just be quick framing, then 3 voters. For the final time, I negate. On framing, remember we both agree that consequentialism, the impacts matter. The first voter is why you're not going to be voting on my opponent's case. They pull through 2 things on their case in their last speech. The first is that controllability can't be good, but the only card in the round on controllability, Perzuki et al. 21, tells you that it's uniquely harmful. Don't buy their empty rhetoric. But then secondly, they completely drop this Ettengoff et al. 21 card throughout the entire round that tells you that hatred also increases. That is going to mean that theism is uniquely harmful. Then they tell you that their PRC card is still going to be valid even though it's self-report and doesn't have an operational definition. Prefer that Ahmed et al. 11 evidence, which they still haven't responded to, that tells you that pro-social increases don't actually happen under theism when you control for the fallibility in their evidence. But then they tell you communities are going to be safer within theism. But that doesn't assess the outgroup, and that's the biggest fallibility in their case. So on both the magnitude with oppression and the scope, because I also assess the outgroup, you're not going to be weighing under their case. Instead, the second voter is going to be on oppression. They tell you oppression is worse in non-theism, that I haven't responded to that. But first, they give you no precedent or proof for that. And secondly, I give you 11 studies that tell you the opposite, and they debunk none of them. But then they tell you they don't have to justify every instance of theism, but insofar as I prove to you that there is a general precedent within both the nature and the use that is systemically harmful and systemically oppressive to women and creates child brides, then that flows clean through. Then they tell you that theism isn't going to mandate child brides or oppression, but they don't respond to that Kramer and Morrow 2 evidence, that Hashimi 22 evidence, or that Jalbadiva et al. 24 evidence, all which tell you that the justifications are leveraged from theistic texts. This is simply empty rhetoric that they give you. But even then, look to the impacts. Every study in today's round tells you that religion is going to be causative of this oppression. Then they tell you look to the death toll, but they give you no precedent for why the death toll is going to be higher in non-theism. So once again, when you look to the nature and the use of the systems and see that theistic systems are going to be systemically more oppressive, that is a clean negation ballot. But then the third and final voter is going to be progress. They try to tell you to extend this analogy of theism being the roots of the tree that blossoms into progress. But the only way it's going to blossom into progress is if the branch falls off and becomes non-theism. Because at the end of the day, what you see throughout every single study in the round that actually addresses that CNVD 13, that Xiao 15, that Carnegie et al. 19 card tells you that at net, on the generalizable principle, which we both agree we're weighing under consequentialism, you see that non-theism is going to be better for human progress. They give you a few empty conjectures telling you that non-theism can't actually motivate morality, but when you look to the consequentialist empirics, you see that that's simply not true. Remember that non-theism is better for that infant mortality, poverty, homicide rates, literacy, per capita income, education, and gender equality, better for human rights, better for human development, better for progress. Thus, since theism oppresses while non-theism promotes progress, I've answered the big question and negate. Thank you.
Caleb. Are we doing a handshake?
All right.
Okay. Wait, I forgot it. Clearly we didn't practice enough.
Yeah, we didn't practice enough.
Yeah.
I'd like to formally introduce you to the two big questions finalists once my adjudication panel is out of here. First, on the affirmative side, the debater today of code 194 is Vanessa Xu. She is from Valley Christian High School in California and coached by Julian Crown. The negative debater today, code 153, is Caleb Waldron from Loveland High School in Colorado. He is coached by Dina Pettit and Caitlin Tapia. The results of this debate and the top 4 big questions debaters will be announced at tonight's award ceremony this evening. Thank you for joining us for the supplemental event finals today, and please join us to celebrate our winners tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at the Altria Theater. Good night from Richmond.